There's a statistic that rarely makes it into surgical journals. Among adults over 70 who undergo a major elective procedure, between 15 and 20%, depending on the study, report within a year that they regret having it done. Not because the surgery itself was a failure, it's because of what they lost during the recovery process: energy, memory, mobility, sometimes even more. That is a profound admission for a patient to make, yet it is almost never part of the conversation before a person signs the consent form. The reality is that surgical guidelines in this country are often still tailored to bodies 20 years younger than the ones actually on the operating table. The protocols haven't entirely caught up with the latest data, and in 5 specific scenarios, 5 surgeries that used to be standard for older adults, the evidence over the past 15 years has changed dramatically. Most patients are simply never informed. I'm Dr. Goodman. I've spent the last 2 decades working at the intersection of cardiology and longevity medicine. A major part of my practice today is helping patients over 65 determine whether a recommended surgery is truly the right step, or if the medical data has quietly moved on without them. What we are going to cover today aren't abstract risks. These are 5 operations where modern research, some of it very recent, indicates that the standard advice needs a serious update. I will explain what has changed, why it changed, and what questions you should be asking instead. Before we dive in, you need to understand a crucial distinction that patients rarely hear clearly. There is the question of whether your body can survive the operation. Then there is an entirely separate question of whether your body can survive the recovery. In a healthy 40-year-old, those are essentially the same thing. By the time you reach 70, they are vastly different questions. And the second one is much more difficult to answer. The difference comes down to what doctors call physiologic reserve. This reserve is what lets your body absorb the massive shock of major surgery, the inflammation, the bleeding, hours under anesthesia, the prolonged immobility during recovery, and bounce back to its baseline. That reserve naturally diminishes through your 50s and 60s. It can drop sharply if you have coexisting conditions, like reduced kidney function, mild cognitive impairment, or frailty markers like weaker grip strength and slower walking speed. When reserve is adequate, surgery usually goes by the textbook. When reserve is insufficient, we see a very different picture. The operation might go perfectly, the patient is discharged, but 6 weeks later, they are simply not the same person who walked into the hospital. This is a very real phenomenon. Clinically, it's known as post-operative cognitive dysfunction. In patients over 70, depending on the research, it happens in 25 to 40% of cases. For most, it clears up over several months. For a significant minority, it does not. Keep this perspective in mind for everything we are about to discuss. The main question is rarely whether a surgery can be performed, it's whether it should be. One last point before we look at the 5 procedures. There is a single question you can ask any surgeon that will reveal in just 15 seconds how seriously they consider what we just talked about. Ask them this: before we schedule this, can I undergo a 4 to 6 week prehabilitation program focusing on nutrition, cardiac conditioning, and blood sugar optimization? If your surgeon replies, "That's a fantastic idea. Here is the protocol," you are in good hands. If they dismiss it and say, "That's not necessary, you'll be fine," you found a doctor whose thinking hasn't updated in 10 years. That one question tells you more than anything in their biography. If a surgeon has ever brought up prehabilitation to you, please leave a comment below with the year and the type of surgery. I am trying to track how often this actually happens in the real world. Truthfully, in 20 years, I can count the number of times a colleague has proactively offered it on my 2 hands. Now, let's get to the 5 operations. 1. Coronary stent placement for stable chest pain. If you have been told you have a coronary blockage and your symptoms are stable, meaning your chest pain happens predictably when you exert yourself and fades when you rest, the guidelines on what to do have shifted significantly. In 2007, a study called the COURAGE trial compared stenting plus medication against medication alone in over 2,200 patients with stable coronary artery disease. After years of monitoring, there was no difference in mortality or heart attack rates. The medication-only group fared just as well. In 2020, a much larger trial named Ischemia, involving over 5,000 patients, confirmed this. For stable disease, the invasive approach did not lower mortality. This conclusion is tough for the medical field to accept, but the data is clear. In stable coronary disease, a stent is a quality-of-life decision, not a life-saving necessity. This matters enormously for older patients because stents come with a cost. The procedure carries a small but genuine risk of stroke. The required blood-thinning medication afterward, sometimes taken for life, greatly increases bleeding risks. And sometimes the stent can clot or narrow again, potentially triggering a heart attack. When is a stent still the right choice? During acute coronary syndrome, such as an active heart attack or unstable, rapidly worsening chest pain. That is a completely different scenario. The ischemia results do not apply to emergencies. They apply to the common situation of a patient with predictable angina being told a stent will fix the problem. What you should ask instead, have we maximized medical therapy first? This means a high-intensity statin, an ACE inhibitor or ARB, a beta blocker if appropriate, strict blood pressure control, an A1C under 7 for diabetics, and a dedicated cardiac rehab program. For many over 70, this regimen yields results comparable to a stent, without the procedure. I recently had a patient, let's call him Henry, who came to me with stable angina. 3 cardiologists had pushed for catheterization. Henry was 73, quite active, and had watched his older brother suffer a poor recovery from a stent procedure. He asked me, point blank, am I a candidate for medical management instead? We optimized everything. Maximum dose atorvastatin, titrated lisinopril, a target blood pressure of 125/75, supervised exercise 3 times a week. 18 months later, his angina is better, not worse. He's out hiking the Sierras with his wife. A stent remains an option if his symptoms change, but it wasn't the right starting point. 2. Carotid endarterectomy for asymptomatic carotid disease. This surgery removes plaque from the neck artery supplying the brain. It's been done for decades. For patients who have already suffered a stroke or a TIA, known as symptomatic disease, the surgery absolutely lowers future stroke risk. That benefit is proven and established. However, for asymptomatic patients, where the plaque was discovered incidentally on a scan without any symptoms, the landscape is completely different today. The initial trials took place in the 1990s, before modern medical therapy. Back then, the annual stroke rate for patients with severe narrowing was about 2%. Surgery dropped it to 1%. Today's medical therapies have drastically changed that baseline. The annual stroke rate for asymptomatic patients on optimized medication is now closer to 0.5%. Back then, the annual stroke rate for patients with severe narrowing was about 2%. Surgery dropped it to 1%. Today's medical therapies have drastically changed that baseline. The annual stroke rate for asymptomatic patients on optimized medication is now closer to 0.5%. But for the majority of asymptomatic people in their 70s, the modern approach should be maximize medical therapy, undergo imaging scans every 12 to 18 months, and only consider surgery if symptoms arise or the disease clearly progresses. What to ask? What is my specific projected annual stroke risk on optimal medical therapy compared to surgery, factoring in the risk of the procedure itself? If your surgeon can't give you concrete numbers, the conversation isn't ready yet. 3. Total knee replacement before age 70 in active patients. This one might seem counterintuitive. We usually view knee replacements as universally beneficial, and for the right person, they are. The catch is the timing. Today's knee implants are fantastic, boasting a 90% survival rate at 15 years. But that data is based on average activity levels. If a 65-year-old is still playing tennis, hiking, and golfing, the implant accumulates wear at almost twice the rate. Practically speaking, a highly active 65-year-old getting a knee replacement today has a 15 to 20% chance of needing a revision surgery in their 70s. Revisions are significantly tougher than the initial surgery. The recovery is longer, complication rates are higher, and pain is harder to manage. Plus, the second implant doesn't last as long as the first, opening the door for a potential third procedure. Because of this, many orthopedic surgeons now suggest a wait and brace strategy. They bridge the gap with cortisone shots, hyaluronic acid, and quad strengthening. The goal is to delay the replacement until the early 70s, when activity levels naturally moderate and the implant's lifespan better aligns with the patient's. This is not a recommendation to ignore knee pain. It's a recommendation to think strategically about timing. What to ask? Given my current activity level and life expectancy, when is the absolute optimal window for this implant? A friend of mine, we'll call her Margaret, now 71, was offered a knee replacement at 63 while she was still competitively skiing. Her surgeon casually glossed over the revision risks. She chose to wait. We managed her with a structured physical therapy program, joint lubrication injections, and a specialized brace during ski season. She finally had the surgery last year at 70. Her recovery was phenomenal, and the implant will likely last her the rest of her life. That is the timing that matches the implant to the patient. 4. Hernia mesh repair for asymptomatic older men. Most hernias in the U.S. are now repaired using mesh to provide structural support and lower recurrence. For symptomatic hernias causing pain, obstruction, or the threat of strangulation, mesh repair is excellent. The issue lies with the asymptomatic or minimally symptomatic cases, a small bulge noticed during a routine exam that doesn't hurt. Historically, doctors recommended fixing these preventatively before they became an issue. Multiple studies over the past 15 years have demonstrated that watchful waiting, observation without surgery, is incredibly safe for this demographic. The lifetime risk of a severe complication, like strangulation, for an older man is well under 2%. Meanwhile, between 5 and 15% of patients who get mesh repairs end up developing chronic postoperative pain. This pain can be severe, difficult to treat, and permanent, as the mesh can contract, fold, or trap nerves. The calculus has shifted. For an older patient with an asymptomatic hernia, the math very often favors waiting. What to ask? If we don't operate, what is the realistic 5-year risk of a complication, and how does that stack up against the odds of chronic post-mesh pain? The yearly risk of those quiet stones causing symptoms is just 1 to 2%. The lifetime risk of a major complication in an older adult is low. On the flip side, 15 to 30% of patients who have their gallbladder removed end up developing post-cholecystectomy syndrome. But what about incidental findings? A patient gets an abdominal ultrasound for an unrelated reason. Stones are noted, and suddenly they are advised to schedule a cholecystectomy before the stones cause problems. The data simply does not back this up. The yearly risk of those quiet stones causing symptoms is just 1 to 2%. The lifetime risk of a major complication in an older adult is low. On the flip side, 15 to 30% of patients who have their gallbladder removed end up developing post-cholecystectomy syndrome, chronic indigestion, bile diarrhea, or ongoing abdominal pain. It is underrecognized, underreported, and it can be lifelong. What to ask? If these stones aren't bothering me, what is the likelihood they will cause problems in the next 5 years? Versus the probability that I trade silent stones for chronic post-surgery digestive issues. For many older adults, particularly those with fewer remaining decades, Watchful waiting is the right answer. If you take away anything from our discussion today, make it this. Surgical decisions over 65 are no longer just about whether a procedure is technically possible. It's about your personal physiologic reserve and unique risks. Write these 4 questions down. Bring them to any preoperative conversation. What is my projected outcome, quality of life, mortality, functional status, 5 years from now if we don't do this surgery and instead optimize medical management? What alternative interventions have been published in the last 5 years for my condition, and what does the data show? What is your personal complication rate for this exact procedure in patients with my specific profile? Not the average, yours. And question 4. Can I do a 4 to 6 week prehabilitation program before we schedule? If a surgeon cannot clearly answer those 4 questions, the conversation hasn't reached the point where you should be signing. I want to end with Henry, the patient I mentioned earlier who opted out of the stents. He sent me a photograph last month. He's standing on a ridge in the Sierras with his wife of 47 years, arms wrapped around each other's shoulders. On the back, he wrote, "We did the trail you said we couldn't. Took us 6 hours. No chest pain. His angina is the best it has been in 5 years." The point is, the decision was made using the right framework at the proper time. That is what every patient over 65 deserves. If something in this video resonated with you, please send this to a loved one. The decision is yours to make, and it should be made with your eyes open. I'm Dr. Goodman. Take care of each other.